This is the Digital Savage Experience Podcast, hosted by Roman Prokopchuk, bringing you all things digital marketing, tech, business, and motivation. What's stopping you from becoming relentless in all aspects of life? Are you ready to become a digital savage? Let's get into today's episode.
Hey everyone, this is Roman Prokopchuk, and this is the Digital Savage Experience Podcast. Today I have with me Elliot Connor. Elliot's the founder and CEO of Human Nature Projects, an international environmental charity supporting volunteers in 104 countries. He is a TED speaker, author, podcast host, and filmmaker with the goal of reframing our human relationship with nature. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Roman. Really looking forward to the show, having an interesting conversation. It should be great to see where things lead, and hopefully the audience will find things interesting to follow, learn something along the way.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about your journey. How did you get to where you are today?
Sure. So, I've always been passionate, interested in the natural world. If you look back a long way, I'm British by birth. I've always had that as part of my upbringing, part of my culture. Those long walks in the countryside, a bit of bird watching. Generally, nature appreciation is much more popular over there. So I was lucky to be brought up in that manner. I guess my appreciation of nature, my knowledge of the natural world was more systematized a few years ago. So it would have been 4 or 5 years ago now. And that actually came through photography. So I spent 6 months documenting, photographing the mini beasts, the insects, spiders, bugs in my garden for about 6 months in every spare afternoon I had. And that really taught me about the taxonomy, about how these creatures live, behaved, how to document them, understand their lives. Since then, I've contributed images to field guides about insects and helped write one myself. But that was, I guess, my opening. So I started with very, very small and then moved onwards. Further opportunities presented themselves. I started doing a lot of local volunteering, so very extensively with organisations in Sydney and surrounds. So I did a lot of work with birds. I did some work with zoos, like animal caring, and that led to about 18 months ago my taking on a volunteer placement at a wildlife rescue and rehab centre in southern France. So it was just at the start of 2019, and I spent about a month over there. It was quite a remote region. I was lodging in a castle, and in some of the long winter nights I spent over there, I was also spending the time passing it by researching the operations of about 200 major environmental NGOs. So I had found it quite difficult to work myself into these spaces, to find volunteering opportunities, to really help make a difference as I'd hoped to. So I guess this was a way for me to see how I might better integrate myself with the field, see what was going on both in Australia and abroad. So covering many of the big names in the space, what they were doing, where they were, how they organised, etc., etc. But what I found basically through that was that especially these larger names, so some of the big figureheads in the field were really struggling to engage with the public and to engage with volunteers. So my experience was much more universal than I'd expected. And that led in a very roundabout way to me starting this charity of mine, Human Nature Projects. So the idea behind that was essentially to create a community within conservation So to create an entry point into the field that would allow everyone, no matter their background, country, language, experience, to make a real tangible contribution to conservation. So providing that entry point, as I say, into the field was something I believed was sorely lacking. And as I mentioned, I continue to do that in the 12 months or so since I started that group. We've grown to encompass volunteers across about 105 countries. So it's gone really well. It's scaled very rapidly. And I think that just attests to the power of the idea. It certainly transformed my life. It's been a busy year ever since doing that. But I've definitely worked myself into these circles. I started helping many, many more people across the world, making a real a difference to the space, hoping to reimagine conservation to become much, much more inclusive. And it's where this philosophy, human nature of mine comes in. So that's this worldview I'm trying to promote, how we can better live as human beings on this planet, how we can change our perspective, shift our view, and you said reframe our human relationship with nature. So it's my belief that if we can do that, then much of the 21st century issues we face, both environmental and social, will collapse. There'll be very, very little resistance to creating the future world we'd like to see.
That's awesome. And oftentimes you find a pain point and you kind of just have to run with it or find a need. And, that's what you kind of exactly did. And with everything going on, I guess, in the world currently, I see, a lot of countries had full lockdowns and stuff like that. And this whole post COVID pandemic world, I feel like seeing stuff in terms of different animal populations and stuff, like certain places where there was a lot of pollution and stuff, when everything slowed down, like nature started healing itself. And it's really interesting to kind of hear those stories around the world.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's been strange times, strange circumstances for nature. And COVID definitely is that double-edged sword. So as populations have gone into lockdown, as countries have closed off their borders, stopped much internal traffic, then you're right, nature has recovered in many places. So we have been seeing those stories. There's been some beautiful ones from New Zealand as well. You might have seen them from zoos and aquariums that have let their animals have free roam of the premises. So really heartwarming tales like that. I saw recently there was a concert they put on in Bologna in the opera house to several thousand potted plants. So that was an interesting idea as well. Some of the interesting concerns, ideals that brought up. I know in Switzerland, they've got this rule as part of their constitution that they have to afford dignity to animals and plants. So what that might mean for these rights of nature and how we interact with other animals and plants. But that idea in Bologna, Italy, I thought that was really interesting. Also, that's another COVID consequence. And whilst some of the big conferences, some of the big gatherings for 2020, of which there were many, have had been postponed or cancelled. So some of the more ambitious plans for world leaders, for countries moving forward, have been set back. I think the community response to environmentalism, to all these social issues, has definitely gained momentum. We're seeing a rise in solidarity, a rise in the following of these grassroots movements. So, yeah, there's positives, there's negatives, but we work with what we have.
That's awesome. So what motivates you to succeed? Obviously, those motivations may have changed over time, but what currently motivates you to succeed?
I think it's two things. So there's partly my love of nature. Obviously, I'm very, very passionate about what I do. I think you have to be working in the space. It is long days, it's hard work, but because I love nature, I'm really interested in protecting it, conserving it, restoring it ultimately. then that keeps me going day in, day out, and ultimately motivates me to succeed. I think is that common rhetoric that we're at this turning point. There is an urgency, a sense of if we don't do it now, when? So that is part of the equation. The other half then is just the people around me. So one of the perhaps unexpected consequences of starting up human nature projects, involving myself in 24 other charities, has been just this incredible support community and mentors, fellow young leaders, people who I'm mentoring. So it's very much that cyclical structure, and I really enjoy the interactions I have with other passionate people each day. So I might be speaking with fellow leaders in a dozen countries in my daily routine and having those conversations, getting to speak with all these inspiring people, hear what they're up to, hear their own experiences, has been really, really transformational for me. Seeing what they can achieve, have achieved through human nature projects or in other ventures I'm part of, that has been really, really good for me. I talk about a model of mass individualism, which is essentially recognizing the power of the individual, seeing what their strengths may be, their skill set, and very much working with that, so supporting them if they have any ideas for how they'd like to change the world, if they've got a vision, some goals they're working towards, but then also connecting them up with a community or a larger collective. So that's, I guess, how human nature projects are set up. It's a very, very effective model. It's allowing all of our volunteers effectively to have this tailored experience, to make a change, to contribute in a way that is very real for them, very personalized for them. And I think that really helps. So it creates a really good relationship with our volunteers and with our volunteer staff. They're all very, very keen, very committed to what they do. So being part of that community and part of the environmental field more generally, especially with this very energized youth movement, is certainly keeping me going. And so that would be the other thing that motivates me.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of surround yourself with people, like-minded people, and obviously people within your profession, your line of work, obviously, that have the same motivation and drive, that obviously sometimes maybe you're not as motivated, that really kind of picks you up and keeps you going. And I think it's important kind of, if, you know, you're not going to do something, who's going to do it? Why not now? So in terms of kind of conservation, you know, we can put it off, we can wait for the ideal situation or funding, or we can do something about it now because we may not have a tomorrow.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we need to very much take into account what's going on. In COVID's brought it to light beautifully, being a zoonotic disease, just how much that shows about our human relationship with nature, how that's harming us just as much as the natural world. So we do need to take a step back, look at the bigger picture and see what's going on, because in many cases it's quite severe. It's going to take a lot of fixing, but we definitely have the means with which to do so. It's about building up the willpower and the following to make sure it happens. I think in the brief time, in the brief span that human nature projects have been around, I've been developing this framework, this philosophy. It's definitely shown some very positive signs of scalability and of success. So I think it's bright for the future, looking forward.
That's awesome. So what's one thing you may have seen as a weakness in yourself in the past that you've turned around and utilized as a strength today?
Oh, yes, it's a really good question. And it's something I'm working on. I struggle with trying to be very introspective, looking at myself very objectively. What I've found, certainly in this journey of mine, is that the most important and the most difficult part of leadership is just an authenticity to self. So if you think leadership essentially is just telling people a story and having them believe it, you're bringing others on a journey, creating this framework, if you will, this creation, and having them accept it and then integrate into it. So bringing them on that journey. But for me, it's very much learning to accept that vulnerability in myself. I'm someone who's naturally introverted. I don't do well public speaking, talking on podcasts, or talking to crowds. So you may have seen I did a TEDx talk very recently. That was very, very unnatural for me, but it was a great experience even so. So I think really opening up, sharing my own story and recognizing the importance of that, being able to accept where I may be, what I can do, what my limits may be, and bring others in to assist, complement that, has been a real learning curve. I've certainly developed much greater faith in others. So I'm a perfectionist. I don't naturally delegate, but I've learned to do so. So it's definitely been a journey. But I think for me, it's been very much opening myself up to others, building a more integral community around myself, and very much taking others on that journey with me has been the hardest part, but also, then again, the most rewarding. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think to a certain extent, I'm a little bit introverted, and I think with the podcast and different speaking engagements, kind of, taking myself out of my comfort zone, I think that's important for us as human beings, because I think the greatest amount of kind of innovation happens when you're outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, it definitely provokes a response if you're not used to it. It can be stressful, definitely. But fortunately, I'm walking that path early, so learning the skill set, and I've come a long way. Being forced into leadership through human nature projects, it's definitely transformed my life.
Yeah, and I think it's important, like you said, for leaders, present an idea and get buy-in, really tell a story, get people passionate about it, people involved, people behind you about it. I think it's important for somebody to, have that skill. It's not necessarily a natural skill. I think it's a emotional IQ kind of skill to, lead others and motivate and inspire others. But I think as you kind of, break into it and do it a little bit more, it's something that you can kind of build up.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a skill you acquire very slowly along this path. But it's also one of the most valuable ones, as well as one of the hardest to learn. That definitely has been a real learning for me, being able to show that and see it in others as well. Being able to open myself up, but also appreciate the strengths and weaknesses of others. And it's not easy, but it's something which will definitely transform leadership, if you will. It will definitely transform your life if you can master it as a skill. It's integral to much of the community building I do, and to running human nature projects, which is essentially one large community. It's very flat in structure. So being able to motivate, to inspire is key to continuing success in these operations.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you also mentioned kind of, putting yourself out there and telling your story. Some people are afraid to share. Some people think their story isn't powerful enough, or they may not reach enough people. But I think everybody has something to share that can impact at least one other person out there, and can really get people involved or help them through a situation and really get them passionate about a subject.
Yeah, no, very much so. One of the things I most enjoyed about setting up human nature projects is hearing other people's stories, seeing where they've come from, where they're going, and how human nature projects has and will support them. So that's been very, very inspiring for me to see. One of the ones which definitely comes to mind is that of Justice Senkoto, So our national director in Lesotho, a tiny mountainous, very low affluence, southern African country. And Justice came from a background in the HR for the Lesotho Olympic team, but he joined us very early in the piece. It would have been the first week or two setting up human nature projects. And essentially what he said is he's always been interested in conservation. It's something which in Lesotho had absolutely no following prior to human nature projects setting up there. So we were the first environmental NGO, the first environmental group to operate in that region. So it was definitely a long process to communicate to these authorities, to tell them our story and why they needed to act. So gaining their support, but then creating this very powerful community across Lesotho, creating that national team, seeing how that's developed, flourished, prospered under the Justice's guidance. So him undertaking that journey alongside us at Human Nature Projects, and with that support, slowly creating a very real public following for the field, educating public. So they're based in the capital, Maseru, and seeing how much that's changed. I saw they recently did celebration for the World Environment Day and for a few other events that went amazingly. And it's thankfully not shut down by COVID or quite by the lockdown. They're doing some school programs, or once schools reopen, that is. But it's definitely been an amazing, inspiring journey for me to follow. Seeing that replicated across so many different countries, seeing these leaders step forward from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of positions, how their national teams, how these international working groups have developed, flourished through the Human Nature Projects model has been that one thing which keeps on giving back to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Being able to share that and then share obviously other people's stories that also may not be able to share themselves. So in turn, obviously somebody will hear this interview and also hear you mentioning that and maybe look into that. Maybe they're on the African continent or like to help there. So it's like you never know who's listening, and you never know in terms of who a conversation or who a story will really touch as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So what's one piece of advice you can leave with the audience, personal or professional?
What's one piece of advice? Well, I think harking back to the earlier point about myself as an introvert and developing that authenticity as a leader, one piece of advice I would follow is just to be sure of yourself, to not hesitate if you have an idea, have a vision. For me, much of the framework, much of the philosophy came, as I mentioned, in that time in France. So in that month I spent over there in January, but I didn't start Human Nature Projects until late June, early July. And part of that was not knowing where it would go and not knowing how it could scale, what it would look like even once I did make that leap of faith. But I think having done so, having started the organization, built it up in those first few months, it was incredible for me to see just how much could be achieved by one such as myself, with very, very little leadership experience prior, with very little formal knowledge about how to run something like this. If you do have a vision, if you do have a goal to create change in the world, whatever it may be, then going ahead doing it and seeing where it leads, it can be one of the most powerful, rewarding things you can hope for. So I never would have imagined where Human Nature Projects could be 12 months on, 105 countries, 1,500 volunteers. It's been that very, very incredible journey scaling for me and for all of those volunteers, so for the entire community. But simply having the courage in oneself, having that belief to take that initial step, and especially to reach out to others. So I'm very lucky in having gained mentorship and support by others more experienced along this journey, whether it's in storytelling mediums, in photography, in filmmaking, in graphic design, in more formalized leadership, management, financing, whatever it may be. But simply having the courage to reach out to others and ask for that help, because people are very, very willing to support, regardless of whether you're 17 like myself or more advanced on the journey. There will be others who have been there before. So there's always learnings you can take, pitfalls you can avoid if you get in early. So, and that would definitely be my learning, to take that leap of faith, to be very clear in your vision and communicate that early. But more importantly, just go ahead and start something, see where it leads. Because if you can be true to yourself, true to your vision, and seek that support from others, there really are very, very few limits to what you can achieve.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't carry out that idea they have and then, materialize it into an actual thing that you fulfill, you make a plan for, and you carry out. I think a lot of people out there have great ideas, but don't have the courage to kind of take that idea and bring it to life.
Very much so. Part of this journey, creating Human Nature Projects, has been helping others to walk that too. So spinning off all sorts of various ideas in this environmental space, which they hadn't had the courage and they hadn't had the perseverance to achieve on their own. So supporting our volunteers in that way has been, as I say, very, very rewarding. So I think if any of our listeners can take that on board, if they have an idea and if they have a vision for the change they want to make, then seeking that support, yes, to do it, but very much taking that leap of faith is the most important part of creating it and of growing it oneself.
Yeah, I agree. So I really appreciate you stopping by today. Can you let the audience know how they can find you?
Sure. So you can visit my website, which is elliotconnor.com, or you can head over to the Human Nature Project's website, humannatureprojects.org, or you can check out my podcast, which is just called Human Nature.
Awesome. Thanks again for stopping by.
Great. Thanks.
Hey, this is Roman Prokopchuk of the Digital Savage Experience podcast. Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
This podcast has been brought to you by Nova Zora Digital. Find out how Nova Zora Digital can help your company grow online. Learn more at novazoradigital.com. Until next time, all you digital savages.